Welcome to CFOs in Motion, presented by CFO Intelligence with your host, Andrew Zezas. Dynamic and direct one-on-one interviews with CFOs and executives from enterprise and middle market companies. And now, here's your host, Andrew Zezas.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to CFOs in Motion, where we bring you interviews with accomplished and insightful CFOs at middle market and enterprise companies. I'm your host, Andrew Zezas, and it's great to be with you today. Today we have with us Bob Arnold, CFO. Bob has over 40 years of experience in successfully driving financial and operational performance in high-growth companies. Bob served as CFO, Vice President Finance, or Controller for organizations ranging from startups to multi-billion-dollar organizations in life sciences, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, professional services, high-tech, and equipment leasing and financing industries. Bob's previous successes include having served as Vice President Finance for Therapeutics, Inc. In that role, Bob provided leadership that enabled AQST to develop from a startup to a fully integrated NASDAQ-listed specialty pharmaceutical company. Bob also led the finance function at HP Financial Services North America from a startup within Compaq Computer to a multi-billion-dollar organization. Bob holds a BS in accounting from Montclair State University and a Master of Science degree in taxation from Seton Hall University. Bob, welcome and thanks for joining me on CFOs in Motion. It's really great to have you here today.
Well, Andy, I'm overjoyed to be here. This is a great opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to getting started.
Great. So we've got an interesting conversation today. We're talking about liquidity, growth, and the long view. So, Bob, let's jump right in. In your role as Vice President of Finance at Therapeutics, the company went from a startup to a public company listing on the NASDAQ in 2018. What were the greatest challenges in growing from one extreme to another?
Well, Andy, I will tell you, it was a very, very long journey with many twists and turns and challenges. It wasn't a straight line, nor was it quick. It lasted from 2007 to ultimately listing on the NASDAQ in 2018. And to start, you got to go back to 2007. We were actually going through an IPO process at that point. The market conditions made sense at that point. We were looking to raise capital for product development, build out our infrastructure, and facilities. So all those things to make us a fully integrated pharmaceutical company. We actually cleared our SEC comments, and we had a roadshow ready to go, planned, bags packed, ready to go. But in October of 2007, the market just imploded. I don't know if everybody can remember, back then, we delayed the offering and ultimately withdrew it. But at the same time, all equity markets, both private and public, dried up. And what did exist was extremely expensive or highly dilutive to our owners. So we had to scramble for funding. We had a business that was growing, business had a lot of potential. We had to scramble for funding. Our investors gave us a temporary bridge loan that helped us gain some traction here, but we had to downsize the company. We were expecting to get a significant amount of money in. We had to downsize the company, scale back our growth plans. Fortunately, we were able to find some financing in April of that year. So October all the way, fast forward to April, we found some venture financing. Cash was getting very low at that time, so it was a extremely nervous point at that point for the company. Also, later that year, we were able to raise some additional equity from our investors, and they converted that bridge loan to equity. So two big things that helped us get off the dime from when, didn't come anywhere near to funding what we were expect, but gave us that initial capital to keep on moving the business. We also, and again, I'm going to take you through a chronology because a lot of these things tell you about the challenges that we had to go through and ultimately get public. We reworked every contract at that point. With an eye to not giving up anything, but still maximizing cash. And believe it or not, most of our customers and partners, as we like to call them, were very amenable to doing that. So that was an important thing. And then we focused we had two products that we had out licensed. We focused on getting them to approval along with our partner because they were generating cash for us from approval milestones and development and approval milestones. And then ultimately, when those products were approved into 2010, it gave us ongoing cash flow from royalties and manufacturing. And at that point, provided a runway to make our manufacturing operations and plant profitable, which in a growth pharmaceutical company, you generally don't see that with revenue coming in and still developing products at the same time. It's generally not something you see. We also took an eye to, while we continued to fund the company, we funded operations without any material equity infusions at that point. So we didn't dilute our investors. And in 2013, we came to I think a very important inflection point in the business. We made a strategic decision, with board approval, to change our direction. And what I mean by that is we were looking at one product at a time, co-developing that product with a partner. We went and made a decision to develop a pipeline of proprietary products that we could ultimately take all the way to commercialization ourselves rather than having to partner with someone else. So what that did, rather than just looking at products that raise cash, that was going to create the long-term value that you needed to ultimately go public. Also in that time, we were able to finance increase our venture debt facility. We went almost threefold, $12.5 million to $37.5 million. That also helped to fund the business. Another important point in 2015, and again, this gave us credibility in the markets, or gave an indication to the markets. In 2015, we refinanced that venture debt with a established, known life science lender, which gave us credibility that, hey, this company is doing what they say they're doing. They have some good prospects, and we're able to lend them $50 million, which is an important point. By 2017, we reached a point that ready to begin the process. We had our products were following up enough along in the pipeline, but that was a lot of planning involved, a lot of things to do. We changed our name, we changed our tax structure. We had a whole comp plan that suited us from a private company standpoint. Wasn't ideal for a public company. Had to change that out. A lot of service providers to bring on, as a public company. And the S1 process, which is, as anyone that has been through it, is like getting a dental cleaning every few weeks from the SEC. So, very interesting, a lot of things. But all that culminated in July of 2018. We went public, and it was, while we didn't ring the bell that day, we raised gross proceeds of $74 million, and we were able to go in and actually see the first trade happen, which was very, very, very interesting and very cool. And then about a month later, we were going to do what every initial public company does, is we rang the bell, which was also a very, very neat thing to do and to see how all that works. But, so that gives you an idea of what we went through. And that was over an 11-year period to get there. A lot of things that had to happen just so to get us where we need. If some things didn't happen, I might not be here talking to you about this particular subject today, but they did. And a lot of hard work went into that from a very, very dedicated team of people. And in post-offering, I had non-finance friends call me up and say, "Oh, what are you doing? Feet up on the desk, doing nothing?" My life really changed, and I was busy before. I'm just as busy, maybe even more so now. You have additional regulatory issues, filing requirements. Everything you do was under a public scrutiny. But on the positive side, it opened up the additional capital markets to us that we didn't have before. So we were able to do a follow-on offering. We were able to do a shelf registration and an ATM. We were able to refinance that life science debt into a $100 million facility. And We also able to do a very significant royalty monetization. All those things, got us to where we are. So, a lot of challenges. One extreme to another. You're not, I wouldn't say flying by the seat of your pants, but you're doing a lot of things that you needed to get done, and you're growing, and then you get to a public company where you have to be a lot more buttoned down and straightforward. So a lot of things took a while, but it was certainly worth the experience to go through it.
Well, I mean, what an experience, and what a path you followed. And you started off your conversation today by saying there's a story, and that was an exciting story, and obviously a great one.
Mhm.
And what have I heard, that luck is the intersection of planning and expertise, or planning and strategy. And it sounds like you guys were both lucky and expert in what you chose to do. So kudos to all of you. And you're right, it was about growth. Your intro was about growth, and it was a long view. And I've always viewed you as being a strategist, but in particular a growth strategist. And in your intro, you talked about a bunch of different types of funding that you went through along the path. Talk to me about, when taking the long view and looking to achieve growth, what are some of the optimal funding approaches that a growth company can take?
I think, Andy, when I look at this, I don't know that there's any one way to fund a company. It's going to, facts, circumstances, who's investing, who's doing things could give you a direction and where you want to go. But if few questions I think any growth company should be asking themselves is, when they consider raising capital or needs for capital, is, when will you need the capital? So create a long-term view and timelines, when you need to, access that capital. So, when do you need to get to the in a pharma lifestyle, environment, it's when you're going to get to the next milestone, when you need, for clinical trials, when are those things going to be? What is your appetite, for investors? Because different types of providers, be it debt or equity, have different requirements and different ways of handling you or not. And you have to be ready for that. And, really understand how the money's going to be spent, because people are going to ask you that. And they're going to want to know where you're going to use the money, how are you using it, and how effective are you at the money I'm giving you is going to be. I would like to think we took a very conservative approach to funding. While we principally used debt, we expanded those facilities as needed. But at the same time, because we had a very good relationship with all our lenders, we were able to reduce our interest rate. Think about, when we took our first debt with the venture lender in 2018. Not a lot of options. That was in the low 20s. Over time, we reduced that to the low teens, but at the same time expanding. So, that tells you, one, you have to provide a clear path to your lenders or financing, and then execute and do what you tell them you're going to do, and constantly communicate with them if there is a hiccup, because invariably there will be. We, as I said before, we funded the operations mainly through debt and the operations, and so we minimized any additional equity and dilution to. And one of the things that not every company can do, but we utilized our internal cash flow for manufacturing operations. That was a godsend, because it enabled the business to fund a good portion of some of the, because developing products in pharma takes a lot of money, takes a lot of time. And one of the things that we did also, and this was early on, is we had a number of customers that needed our facilities for things they were doing. We got them to fund the facility. That's the basis for where we manufacture everything today. So, it was a great win-win for them. They got their product faster. We got a state-of-the-art production facility that was essentially financed and paid for by a vendor. And then, and this goes for any company at any stage, but I think for funding, and I view this as a funding approach, is tight control over costs and expenses and investment. Know what you're spending, know how you're spending it, and set clear guidelines for people and make sure there's no leakage from that.
So let's stay with the idea of growth companies and talk to me about cash management. You mentioned funding and liquidity, but specifically talk to me about cash management. How should growth companies be focused on cash management?
The first thing is, and it may seem very basic and simplistic, but you'd be surprised, um, what may happen sometimes. I think you need to have a very robust cash forecast. And depending on how and going out a reasonable period of time. I don't mean 13 weeks, I mean longer than that, because that's going to help you see or provide an early warning signal to when you may have a liquidity issue. And another important part of that is, don't assume profits equal cash, especially in the short term. If you say, well, I have EBITDA, positive EBITDA, but your terms from your customers are much longer than the terms from your vendors. So that might be profitable, and it creates a mismatch. So you really need to keep that in mind, and don't assume profits, especially in the short term, translates into a cash, because otherwise you could create a liquidity situation. I think you also take a holistic view and you educate the company so that everyone understands that what they do impacts cash. Be it, and you would think, oh, I'm doing my business, leave me alone. No, what you do impacts cash, impacts our ability to do other things. So I think rather than have everyone this view work in their silo, have them understand how things, and it just gets when you're dealing with a management team, leadership team, it can filter down, but definitely you have to start there. Also, optimizing your working capital, and there's a cash conversion cycle, be it managing receivables and payables. I talked about control previously about, managing, your costs and expenses. Where's your overhead? What are your operating expenses? Keeping a tight control on them can certainly manage your cash flow. And then depending on the business you're in, a component of working capital can be your inventory. If you're manufacturing retail, that the lead times there can be long, and so learning how to manage that. And then if you're in a service business, compensation, that's probably your largest expense, but learning how that works and how that works into your cash conversion cycle. And one thing, and it's not always easy to do this next thing, but I can't minimize it, is create some dry powder for a rainy day. I know sometimes it's not possible, but a rainy day can be, customers late on a payment. You lost a major customer. You'll need that dry powder. Or on a positive note, for opportunistic situations, something that you want to invest in something. You have an opportunity to invest in something. If you don't have that dry powder, it's difficult to do that. And then if you have a credit facility, make sure you can utilize it when you need it, and you have that flexibility. And gets back to what I talked about before about relationships with your lenders.
Bob, given all that, talking about risk, how should CFOs guide their CEOs, their boards, depending upon the size of the company, as it relates to managing liquidity risk specifically?
For me, and I view this, again, I'm a simple guy, so I view things simplistically. Cash is king. If you don't have cash, you're out of business. And, a lot of people, that would seem, everyone understands that. Well, not really. And I think you need to educate everyone on what are the sources of liquidity risk? Where do things come from? You might not have all these existing in your company, but if they're not educated to them, they're not going to be aware of them. It's the CFO's job and the finance team's job to make sure everyone understands that and keep it top of mind. But, you make sure one of the liquidity risk, and I talked about this before, is a cash flow management, lack of cash flow management. And what I mean by that is you're not forecasting either properly at the current level of detail or within the proper timeframes, or you don't have the correct assumptions. That in itself can create a huge liquidity risk. You would think that's simplistic, but it's inability to obtain financing, be it debt or equity. That markets could be dried up, difficult, or you don't have the financials yet because banks want you to be perfect before they lend to you. Unexpected economic disruptions. Did any of us think the pandemic was going to hit? Plan that into their assumptions. Because if you do, I'm taking you to Atlantic City next week. And then also, in supply chain, think about how that's disrupted people's businesses, in terms of if you're in the construction industry, trying to get materials just to finish your job. And another area, while it's a positive and it supports growth for the business, this capital expenditures. You think about it, let's say in pharmaceuticals, you're building out a plant, you're building out a lab. That costs a lot of money. You might not see that, your cash outlay is up front or clear, but your benefit is well, in excess. So that can create liquidity risk. And then debt repayment. You're going to have to, you can have debt and that's great, but it's something you're going to have to service it. And that's, generally, monthly or quarterly, and you need to do that. Otherwise you're defaulting on your borrowing, or, you have to repay it at some point or be able to refinance it. So if you're not positioned to do that, what is that going to do? You're going to have, big bullet payment of, from a loan that's due at some point. So you need to be on top of that and make sure everyone's aware of that and what that means. And that's a profit crisis, and that could be anything from your major customer having some hiccups, things like that, which can create, they sneeze and you catch a cold. So, it's those type things. So, and simple choices. I talked about everyone understanding what needs to be understood in terms of, liquidity and cash and how all the pieces fit together. So, you have sales negotiating a contract, and they might have different terms that are longer than you're comfortable with, or have a mismatch to your payments for either compensation or vendors associated with a particular project. So making sure everybody understands what those risks are and goes in with that knowledge, as opposed to coming back and saying, well, why are you at 60 days? You should be at 30 days. So it's important to make sure everybody understands what they need to do.
Overall, if you were in a room with a group of not up and coming CFOs at companies that were taking on roles at growth companies, what would be your overall guidance to those CFOs?
Well, as I said at the outset, your path is not going to be straightforward, straight line. It's not going to be quick in some cases, but don't let it phase you. That's the nature of what you're doing. If you're in that type of environment, you have to understand there's going to be ups and downs and so forth. But you've heard the saying, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. That's what you need to do. You need to have a plan. Well, in the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, you have the timing and cost of human trials. They can be delayed. You can have additional trials that are needed. They can cost more than you think about. You need to be prepared for that. So when it does happen, monitor it, make sure it, try to keep a fence around it so it doesn't happen. But there are going to be things outside of your control. And then you add on top of that the fact that you have an FDA review and approval process that can be sometimes opaque to the rest of the world in terms of when things go. And so you need to understand that you need to be prepared for what might occur, and don't let it surprise you, because in some cases that's half the fun in what you're doing.
Would you offer any different advice if you were in that room meeting with a group of private company CEOs?
No, I would tell them the same thing.
Be prepared and don't let it phase you.
Yeah, and you need to understand that there's going to be things that don't, we might have the greatest idea, the greatest technology. We need to be aware that things might take longer and than needed.
Now, you mentioned the pandemic a few moments ago. Were there any particular lessons you learned relative to growth and the long view?
Yeah, I would say first one is when it all hit in March of 20, everything everywhere closed. We went from everybody essentially being 100% in the office to no one in the office. At first, I was very concerned. How do we close the books? We have to report as a public company. We never did this. We're all sitting, in an office. We're all sitting next to us. But one of the things I learned is not learned, but it came out of this was we actually made ourselves more efficient. We looked at, and some of this was probably overdue, and the pandemic, forced us to maybe address some things. We actually sat down, the whole finance team, and we streamlined and improved the closing process. We cut out things that we maybe didn't need to do. We moved things up. We actually took about 5 days out of the process, which wasn't a long process to start with, but took about 5 days out of it. And it was a collaborative effort. We communicated a lot. We did things a little differently than maybe when you're sitting in the office next to it, and made everybody connected to the process. And this goes for everything. We learned how to utilize tools better. Whether it be what we're on today, Teams or Zoom. They existed, but we learned to utilize them and optimize them better. Either meetings or sharing documents, and things that really made a lot of sense. But I will tell you, our sales team, we have a product called Sympazam at Aquestive, and the sales team, generally sold their product to healthcare providers by visiting the offices. So, that avenue was, no longer available to our sales team. They found a way, utilizing some of the tools that I talked about and different ways of talking to people, different ways of approaching it, to keep that sales process going and keeping quarter over quarter growth sustained. So, kudos to them for getting that done during that time period. And I think, the company culture we had, that was some glue that held things together. There was a culture there before of collaboration. So before the pandemic. So having to do more of it because you were remote, and it wasn't really an issue to anyone to get that done. And it was already ingrained in the business.
So, Bob, finance is often unfairly accused of being, closed off, ivory towerish. The CFO is is in charge of the word no, and things that you and I both know aren't real and aren't true, but often come up in conversation. As it relates to finance's role, talk about how finance can be beneficial in aligning the behavior of sales, operations, and other functional units within a company's within a company relative to taking the company in the direction of its business objectives.
Yeah, I think that's it's very important. I mean, and I think everyone needs to move in the same direction and with a shared purpose. Everyone has their own jobs, but they need to understand that everyone's dependent on someone else for success. Using a football analogy, if the offensive line doesn't block, what happens to the best running back in the game? Doesn't go very far. So it's all integrated. But what finance needs to do, and this is how you get away from this, no type thing. You need to ensure all functions understand and have plans and resources in place to execute on their commitments. I think that's very important. And you frequently need to measure things and make sure how are we doing, and is there a course correction to do it, but do it collaboratively and do it as a group and not as dictating or one-sided. And I think another area that I found is important and I think instructive for connecting like sales, operations, and everyone to an aligned behavior is compensation plans. We had a compensation plan at HP Financial Services for our sales folks that aligned the behavior in terms of the whole continuum of a piece of equipment. So when you put a piece of equipment on lease, it had, you had an initial term, and then you were going to hope at the end to either release that or remarket it. And we found initially that they weren't spending any time on the back end, which sometimes those could be substantial investments. We changed the comp plan to align that behavior. So, you had some skin in the game for the back end of the deal. It ended up being, it ended up being more profitable for us because now everyone was aligned on the whole continuum of the business.
In that vein, can finance actually be a catalyst to lead collaboration and drive overall success?
Absolutely. I I I think that's imperative if the company's going to be successful and finance is going to be successful. I think the first thing begins with finance meeting its commitments to the company. Doing what we say we're going to do. Then you establish trust. How can you ask someone else to make a commitment or do something if you're not meeting your commitments? So that's very important. And I think I've always tried to make the business take a broad view finance of the business, not your narrow view. Yes, we have some specific things we have to do, but the salespeople don't. You make them aware of what they have to do. You give them parameters in which to do things, but work with them. Listen to your colleagues. What are their needs? What their needs are, and how can you help them? I think if you have that type of attitude and behavior, it's going to go a long way to making finance, part of that collaboration, and build that to where you become a trusted advisor or a team of trusted advisors, so that functions come to you for advice, counsel, and to solve problems, and you don't hear about it after it's already a problem. I think if you do those things and work towards that, you can make yourself finance very, very successful and part of the success of the company.
Bob, you've had an interesting career. You've been with great companies. You had a long career, and you've accomplished a lot in and out of finance. But I know you've had a diverse career as well. Share with me some of the experiences that you've had that were outside of finance, but contributed to the successes that you were able to achieve in the companies you served.
Right. And I would say, Andy, I've been fortunate that most of the roles I've had, even within finance, have been very close to the business. But they're, so making decisions, being involved in transactions and so forth. But there's been some roles, why I still was in the finance function that I had in various companies. I mean, I would point to one to start off at HP Financial Services. I was co-chair with the managing director at the time of the pricing and credit committees of the company. So we were making strategic decisions on how to price our transactions, how to set policy, how to do all those things, which were very integrated in the business. And I was also the lead person for any special pricing. So if you were a salesperson, you had a deal that was outside the parameters, you would come to me, and we work to get a solution. So that was, I thought, a interesting role, not necessarily something you see all CFOs, VP finance people doing. And at the same time, I was helping and involved in multi-million-dollar decisions to drive the business forward. Another area that I was responsible for and was working on at HP was, and this was a transitional period. They needed some leadership. And I assumed P&L and leadership responsibility for what's called lifecycle management, the people who were responsible to work with the salespeople for mid-end of lease activity. There was hundreds of millions of dollars of exposure as equipment came off lease. We went in there. We were able to provide returns that were over our residual investment and certainly, provided profit. But also we built operational infrastructure and linkages to the sales team from a company, because this was at the early stages of this particular environment. So, not something you generally see your finance leader going in and doing. But I went in, did it. I think it was something that stays with me today as to how you have to deal with people and bring in the holistic view to the company. And then I've always had sales compensation under me, but I never viewed it as just, here's what people earned and here's what we're going to pay you and when we're going to pay you. I view it, and it goes back to a question you had before about aligning behavior and always setting up comp plans that align behavior. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? And you generate a plan that does that. That compensates the sales team for that, but at the same time gets the business what they need. And it doesn't always work that way in a lot of companies, but that's what I've always tried to do. So those are things, some roles that have been outside of finance or tangential to finance, but had a more of a business flavor, was not a command and control type thing, was actually making the decisions.
Bob, I've got time for one more question. I know that, like me, you are of the mindset that those of us who have succeeded and have had good careers, for those of us who find ourselves in that position, it's incumbent upon us to provide guidance and the benefit of our experience to those who will come after us. What advice would you give to CFOs who are, career advice in particular, who are, starting out, first CFO role, looking forward to the future of their career?
Yeah, I even go a little bit back before they get that. It's anyone that's going down this path and aspires to be a CFO or CFO type role is, first thing you got to do is build a strong foundation. Build that, retain knowledge. Again, some of this is, some of your basic blocking and tackling. I always seem to go back to my football roots, but basic blocking and tackling. Listen, learn, ask questions. I don't care what stage of your career you're in. If you're able to do those effectively, you're going to be good at what you do, along with retaining knowledge. And learn to be a teacher, especially when you're a CFO or becoming a CFO. Teach people, share knowledge, give them your learnings, because that'll help you build a strong team. No one does this alone. It's always, I always like to say it's a team. It's we. It's never, alone that you do this. And for a CFO, if you build a strong team and you have I'll give you an example, a strong controller, that person is worth their weight in gold to you, because they're gonna give you the flexibility to do a lot of strategic things that you want. So building a strong team. And believe it or not, especially when you're a CFO, and you need to be able to sell yourself. So now you become an influencer. You need to build relationships. You need to justify decisions and position to not only, your auditors, but to the investing world, if you're a public company, to your board, to the company as a whole. And again, going back to that factor, create trust. So become a trusted advisor.
Well, and Bob, I've heard you say before that as a CFO at a privately held company, some of the people you should be teaching and influencing are the very people you work for, the CEO and the owner of private companies. I think you've been spot on when you've made that comment in the past.
I couldn't agree more, Andy. And I think it just makes everyone's life a lot easier if we all understand what we need to do, and we all work together to get it done.
Well, Bob, this has been great. I want to thank you very much for appearing with us today on CFOs in Motion.
And Andy, likewise, this has been great. I've enjoyed getting ready for this. I've enjoyed the conversation as always with you, and I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity again.
Well, I'm glad you're with us. I thank you very much. I hope you'll come see us again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining Bob Arnold, CFO, and me today. I'm Andrew Zezas, your host for CFO Intelligence and CFOs in Motion. We'll see you next time on CFOs in Motion.
Thanks for joining us on CFOs in Motion, presented by CFO Intelligence with your host, Andrew Zezas. If you have an interesting topic that you'd like us to discuss here on CFOs in Motion, or if you've got a great CFO topic that you're passionate about and would like to be interviewed on this podcast series or published in CFO Intelligence magazine, visit CFOintel.com. That's CFOINTELL.com. Remember to subscribe to this podcast series on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. This has been CFOs in Motion, presented by CFO Intelligence with your host, Andrew Zezas. We'll see you next time. The opinions and views presented on this podcast by Andrew Zezas are his own and may not be relied upon as fact. The opinions and views of others who appear on this show are their own as well, and may not be relied upon as fact or for any other purpose. Opinions and views and other information are provided for general information and educational purposes only.